A family adopts a retired police dog, hoping for a fresh start. But the next night, it won't stop barking at the basement door, growling, pacing, warning them of something unseen. Then, the little girl whispers, "The man in the basement keeps talking." When they dig in the backyard, they uncover a rusted police badge. The name on it? A detective who vanished years ago. Last seen in this very house. What secret is buried beneath their feet? And why does it feel like they're not alone? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of the old countryside home as Lisa Carter watched her children lead their newest family member through the front door. Max, the retired German Shepherd, padded gracefully across the wooden floors, his intelligent eyes taking in every detail of his new surroundings. "He's so well behaved," Lisa remarked, remembering how the adoption center officer had praised Max's training. Her 12-year-old son, Joseph, beamed with pride as he held the leash loosely, allowing Max to explore at his own pace. "Can I pet him now, Joey?" 8-year-old Maddie bounced on her toes, her pigtails swinging with excitement. She had been patient during the car ride home, just as they'd promised the officer they would be. "Gentle, remember?" Joseph guided his sister's small hand to Max's fur. The dog turned his head and gave Maddie's palm a gentle lick, making her giggle. Lisa felt a warmth in her chest she hadn't experienced since losing her husband last year. The sound of children's laughter filling their new home was exactly what she'd hoped for when she decided to move them to the countryside. The little house needed some work, but its price had fit their budget, allowing her to cut back on extra nursing shifts and spend more time with her children. Max continued his inspection of the house, his nails clicking against the floor as he moved from room to room. Joseph followed close behind, watching with fascination as the dog sniffed corners and doorways. Their neighbor, Mrs. Whitman, had already dropped off a welcome basket, and Max's nose led him to investigate the fresh-baked cookies on the kitchen counter. "No, boy," Lisa called out gently. "Those aren't for you." Max immediately backed away from the counter, showing his impressive training. But as he turned toward the hallway, something changed. His body suddenly went rigid, ears perked forward, and his tail dropped low. Standing in front of the basement door, Max let out a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "What's wrong, boy?" Joseph knelt beside him, concerned. "He's probably just nervous about the new space," Lisa said quickly, not wanting the children to worry. "The officer did say he might need time to adjust." But Max's behavior was striking. The confident, calm dog they'd met at the adoption center had transformed into a statue of alertness, his eyes fixed on the basement door as if he could see through it. "Maybe he smells a mouse," Maddie suggested, hiding slightly behind her mother. Lisa nodded, trying to keep things light. "That's probably it, sweetie. Come on, Max. Let's get you settled in the living room." Joseph tugged gently on the leash, and after a moment's hesitation, Max allowed himself to be led away from the door. But he kept looking back, and the low rumble in his chest didn't quite stop. Lisa pushed away a flutter of unease. They were all just adjusting, she told herself. In time, this house would feel like home to all of them. Even Max. The old house creaked and settled in the darkness as Joseph lay in his new bed, trying to fall asleep. The unfamiliar shadows on his ceiling kept morphing into strange shapes, making it hard for his mind to rest. Max had chosen to sleep by his bedroom door, and the dog's steady breathing had been oddly comforting, until it suddenly stopped. Joseph heard the click of Max's nails on the wooden floor, followed by the soft pad of paws moving down the hallway. He sat up, straining his ears. Then came the sound. Scratching, persistent, and desperate against wood. Following the noise, Joseph crept into the hallway. In the dim light filtering through the windows, he saw Mac's dark shape at the basement door. The dog's paws worked frantically at the base of the door, and a deep, urgent growl rumbled from his chest. "Max?" Joseph whispered, his heart beginning to race. "What's wrong, boy?" The German shepherd didn't acknowledge him. Instead, his growls grew deeper, more threatening. He positioned himself in front of the door, his body rigid and alert, as if facing an unseen enemy. Joseph had never seen a dog act like this before. It sent chills down his spine. Small footsteps padded behind him, and he turned to find Maddie rubbing her eyes sleepily. Her stuffed rabbit dragged on the floor beside her. "Joey," she mumbled, "why is Max making that noise?" "Go back to bed, Maddie," Joseph said, trying to sound braver than he felt. But Maddie's eyes suddenly widened. She clutched her rabbit tighter, pressing it against her chest. "Someone's whispering," she said in a tiny voice. Joseph froze. At first, he heard nothing but Mac's growls and his own pounding heart. Then, there it was. A sound so faint he might have imagined it, coming from behind the basement door, like the rustle of dry leaves, or maybe whispers. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. Mac's growls intensified, but the dog didn't try to stop him. Taking a deep breath, Joseph turned the handle and opened the door, just a crack. Darkness. Complete and absolute darkness flowed from the basement like black water. Joseph's eyes struggled to adjust, and that's when he saw them. Pale marks on the wooden floor, just inside the doorway. Scratch marks, old and deep, scored into the wood as if something had tried to claw its way out. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard it hurt. With shaking hands, he slammed the door shut and twisted the lock. Max immediately pressed his body against Joseph's legs, still growling, still facing the door, as if standing guard. "Joey!" Maddie's voice quivered. "I'm scared." "It's okay," he said automatically, though nothing felt okay. He took his sister's hand, feeling how cold and small it was in his. Let's go back to bed." But Max wouldn't move from his spot. He remained there, rigid and watchful, as Joseph led Maddie back to her room, the sound of the dog's growls following them down the dark hallway. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Joseph pushed his cereal around in his bowl, dark circles under his eyes from his sleepless night. His mom bustled around in her nurse's scrubs, preparing for her early shift. "Mom," he started, his voice hesitant. "Something weird happened last night with Max." Lisa paused, coffee mug halfway to her lips. "What do you mean, honey?" Joseph told her about Mac's strange behavior at the basement door, about the scratching and growling. When he mentioned Maddie hearing whispers, Lisa's expression shifted from concern to gentle dismissal. "Sweetie, Max was a police dog, remember? He's probably just extra alert in a new place. And Maddie was half asleep. You know how imagination works when you're tired." "But Mom, the scratch marks are probably from previous owners' pets," Lisa interrupted softly. "Let's not let our imaginations run wild, okay? We finally have a fresh start here." After his mom left for work, Joseph couldn't shake his unease. He wandered outside, where their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Whitman, was tending to her rose bushes. Her weathered hands paused when she saw him approach. "Good morning, Joseph," she said, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "How are you settling in?" "Fine, I guess," he replied, scuffing his shoes in the grass. "Mrs. Whitman, do you know anything about our house? About the people who lived here before?" The old woman's smile faded slightly. She glanced at Joseph's house, then back at him. "That house," she said quietly, "has quite a history, dear. The last owner, Detective Lawson, well, he just vanished one day. Left everything behind. Such a strange business. Joseph's heart skipped a beat. Vanished? Mrs. Whitman nodded solemnly. Be careful, dear. Some houses keep secrets better, left alone. Before Joseph could ask more questions, he heard Maddie's voice from their backyard calling his name. He rushed around the house to find Max frantically digging in the soil near the old oak tree, dirt flying everywhere. Max, stop! Joseph called. But the dog was relentless, his powerful paws tearing into the earth with desperate determination. Something metallic glinted in the disturbed soil. Joseph's hands trembled as he reached down and pulled the object free. Clumps of dirt fell away to reveal a police badge, its surface dulled and rusted with age. His fingers traced the engraved numbers barely visible beneath years of corrosion. What's that? Maddie asked, peering over his shoulder. Joseph stared at the badge, his mouth dry. Max sat beside him, panting heavily, his dark eyes fixed on the mysterious object in Joseph's hands. The dog's usual playful demeanor was gone, replaced by an intensity that made Joseph's skin prickle with goosebumps. Joseph slipped the muddy badge into his pocket before his mom could see it, his heart racing with a mixture of fear and excitement. Later in his room, he carefully cleaned the badge with an old toothbrush, revealing the name beneath the rust. Detective James Lawson. His fingers flew across his laptop keyboard, searching for any information about the detective. Page after page turned up empty, showing only basic employment records from the local police department. It was as if Detective Lawson had simply vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind. The house grew quiet as night fell. Joseph could hear his mom putting Maddie to bed, their muffled voices drifting through the walls. He was about to close his laptop when Max's deep growl broke the silence. The sound sent chills down his spine. Max? He whispered, but the dog was already padding down the hallway, his nails clicking against the wooden floor. Lisa's voice came from the kitchen. Joseph, what's wrong with Max? The German Shepherd stood rigid in front of the basement door, his hackles raised. This time his growl was deeper, more urgent. Joseph watched as his mom's expression shifted from annoyance to concern. All right, Lisa said, reaching for the light switch. Let's put an end to this mystery. The basement lights flickered on, casting harsh shadows down the wooden stairs. Lisa descended first, with Joseph close behind and Max following cautiously. The basement looked ordinary enough. Boxes of Christmas decorations, old furniture, dusty shelves lined with forgotten items. See? Lisa gestured around. Nothing to worry about. A creaking sound echoed from somewhere deep in the basement, like a door swinging on rusty hinges. Max's ears perked up, and he let out a low whine. Must be the house settling, Lisa said quickly. But Joseph noticed how she hurried them back upstairs, shutting the door firmly behind them. Later that night, after his mom had gone to bed, Joseph couldn't sleep. The badge felt heavy in his hands as he sat at his desk, the lamp casting a soft glow over his laptop screen. He typed Detective Lawson into the local newspaper archives, scrolling through years of articles. Suddenly, his breath caught in his throat. There, dated 3 years ago, was a headline that made his blood run cold. Detective goes missing. Last seen at Carter residence. Joseph's eyes darted over the article, taking in phrases like investigation ongoing and no leads found. His hands trembled as he realized the Carter residence mentioned wasn't his current home. It was another house entirely. But why had Max found the detective's badge here? And why did the basement door keep calling to them? Max's warm body pressed against his leg, and Joseph looked down to find the dog's intelligent eyes fixed on him, as if saying, "Now you understand." The next morning, Joseph's hands shook as he showed his mom the article on his laptop. Lisa's face grew pale as she read. but she quickly shook her head, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Honey, this happened at a completely different house," she said, her voice tight. "It has nothing to do with us. You're letting your imagination run wild." "But Mom, Max found the detective's badge in our backyard." "That can't be a coincidence," Joseph protested, watching his mother's expression carefully. Lisa closed the laptop with a firm click. "Joseph, please. We've been through enough this year. I don't want you filling your head with scary stories." The day dragged on, with Joseph unable to focus on anything else. As evening approached, the family gathered in the living room. Lisa was folding laundry while Joseph pretended to do his homework, sneaking glances at the basement door every few minutes. Suddenly, Maddie looked up from her coloring book, her innocent voice cutting through the quiet. "Why does the man in the basement keep whispering?" The laundry basket slipped from Lisa's hand, scattering clean clothes across the floor. Joseph felt his heart skip a beat. "What man, sweetie?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The one I hear at night," Maddie said matter-of-factly, still coloring. "When I get up to use the bathroom, I can hear him through the vent. He sounds sad." Joseph watched his mother's face turn white. She quickly gathered Maddie in her arms, murmuring something about an overactive imagination. But Joseph could see the fear in her eyes. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Joseph crept downstairs with a flashlight. Max followed silently, his presence both reassuring and nerve-wracking. The basement door creaked as they entered, and Joseph winced at the sound. The beam of his flashlight swept across the cluttered space. Max moved with purpose, leading him past old boxes and dusty furniture. The dog stopped near a tall wooden shelf pushed against the far wall, his tail straight and alert. Joseph examined the shelf carefully, running his fingers along its edges. The detective's badge in his pocket seemed to grow heavier. As he pushed against the shelf, it scraped slightly across the concrete floor, revealing something metallic behind it. His heart pounding, Joseph squeezed behind the shelf. There, partially hidden by cobwebs and years of dust, sat a small, rusted lockbox. It was about the size of a shoebox, with a heavy padlock securing its contents. Max whined softly, pawing at the ground near the box. Joseph picked it up with trembling hands, surprised by its weight. Whatever secrets it held, he had a feeling they were about to change everything. Joseph's hands trembled as he examined the contents of the lockbox. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a ring of old keys and a weathered photograph. He picked up the photo carefully, holding it under his flashlight beam. His breath caught in his throat. The image showed a younger Max, his coat glossier and his stance proud, standing next to a tall police officer in uniform. The officer's smile was warm and confident as he rested his hand on Max's head. But what made Joseph's heart skip was the badge gleaming on the officer's chest, the exact same one they'd found buried in their backyard. "So this is where you came from, boy," Joseph whispered, glancing at Max, who sat watching him intently. The dog's ears perked up at his voice, but his eyes remained fixed on the photo. Joseph set the picture aside and picked up the keys. There were 5 of them, each one different, some brass, some steel, all showing signs of age. As he turned them over in his palm, his flashlight beam caught something else. A rusty metal ring set into the concrete floor, partially hidden under an old rug. His heart began to pound harder as he pushed the rug aside. There it was, a heavy padlock securing what appeared to be a trap door. Joseph looked at the keys in his hand, then back at the lock. One key in particular seemed the right size and shape. "What do you think, Max?" he whispered, his voice shaking slightly. "Should we see what's down there?" Max whined softly, but didn't move from his spot. Joseph wiped his sweaty palms on his pajama pants and knelt beside the lock. The key slid in easily, too easily for something so old. His hand shook as he began to turn it. The click that followed seemed to echo through the entire basement, unnaturally loud in the silence. Joseph froze, afraid someone upstairs might have heard it. But what happened next made him scramble backward in shock. Max, who had been quiet and watchful until now, suddenly erupted into fierce barking. The German shepherd's hackles rose as he backed away from the trap door, his normally gentle demeanor transformed into an aggressive stance. "Max, quiet!" Joseph hissed, terrified the noise would wake his mom and sister. But Max wouldn't stop. The dog continued barking, his deep growls punctuating each bark as he moved between Joseph and the trap door, as if trying to prevent him from going any further. Joseph had never seen Max act this way before. The dog's reaction sent chills down his spine, and he could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. Whatever lay beneath that trap door, Max clearly didn't want it opened. Joseph stared at the trap door, his heart still racing from Max's fierce reaction. Something about the dog's behavior made him pause, his hand hovering over the lock. Max's barks weren't just aggressive. They held a note of desperation, almost like a plea. "Okay, boy," Joseph whispered, pulling the key back. "We won't open it." The moment he moved away from the trap door, Max's barking subsided to low whimpers. Later that morning, Lisa found Joseph at the kitchen table, dark circles under his eyes from lack of sleep. She sat down across from him, her face etched with worry. "Honey, we need to talk," she said softly, reaching for his hand. "I'm concerned about how much time you're spending on all this mystery stuff." Joseph pulled his hand away. "Mom, there's something wrong with this house. Max knows it too." Lisa sighed, rubbing her tired eyes. "Joseph, Max is a retired police dog. Of course he's going to act strange sometimes. It's his training." She straightened in her chair, her nurse's uniform already wrinkled from her early morning shift. "But you need to focus on what's important right now. Your grades are slipping, and Mrs. Peterson called about you falling asleep in class." "But Mom—" "No buts." Lisa's voice was firm, but gentle. "I need those keys, Joseph." Joseph's shoulders slumped as he reached into his pocket and handed over the ring of keys. They felt heavy in his palm, like they were trying to pull him back toward the basement's secrets. That night, Joseph lay in bed, unable to sleep. Max paced back and forth outside his door, nails clicking against the hardwood floor. The dog would stop occasionally, letting out low whines before resuming his patrol. Joseph checked his phone. 2:59 a.m. The house was completely silent except for Max's movement. Then, as the numbers on his phone changed to 3 o'clock, a deep thud resonated through the walls. It sounded like something heavy falling or moving in the basement. Max's pacing stopped instantly. Joseph held his breath, straining to hear more. Another thud followed, then silence. In her room, Lisa bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding. The sound had pulled her from a deep sleep, leaving her disoriented. Mother's instinct kicked in, and she quickly got up to check on her children. She moved quietly down the hallway, first peering into Maddie's room. Her daughter was sound asleep, clutching her favorite stuffed animal. Next, she checked Joseph's room, finding him pretending to sleep, Max still standing guard outside his door. But as Lisa turned to go back to bed, something made her blood run cold. The basement door, which she distinctly remembered closing and locking before bed, now stood slightly ajar, darkness seeping through the gap like black ink. Joseph waited until he heard his mother's bedroom door close before slipping out of bed. His bare feet made no sound on the cold floor as he crept down the hallway, Max following closely behind. The moonlight streaming through the windows cast long shadows that made his heart beat faster. At his mother's door, he hesitated. Breaking into her room felt wrong, but the mystery of the basement pulled at him like a magnet, Taking a deep breath, he turned the handle and stepped inside. Lisa's room was neat and organized, just like everything else she did. Joseph searched carefully, checking drawers and shelves, but the keys were nowhere to be found. Frustration built in his chest as he looked under the bed, in her jewelry box, and even in her work bag. "They have to be here somewhere," he whispered to himself, running his hands through his hair. "Are you looking for something?" Maddie's small voice made him jump. She stood in the doorway in her pink pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Maddie, you scared me," Joseph whispered harshly. "Go back to bed." "The man took them," she said matter-of-factly, hugging her stuffed rabbit closer. Joseph froze. "What man? What do you mean?" Maddie yawned, seemingly unbothered by her own words. "He whispered last night. He said he needed his keys back." She said it so casually, as if she were talking about what she had for lunch. A chill ran down Joseph's spine. "When did you hear this?" "When the clock said 3, she replied, then turned and wandered back to her room. Joseph followed her, his mind racing. Max trotted ahead, suddenly alert. As they entered Maddie's room, the dog's behavior changed dramatically. He made a beeline for her closet, scratching at the door and letting out a low, threatening growl. "Max, quiet," Joseph whispered urgently, not wanting to wake their mother. He opened the closet door slowly, his hands shaking slightly. Max's nose led them to Maddie's collection of dolls, lined up neatly on a shelf. The dog focused on one particular doll, an old porcelain one with a blue dress that Joseph had never seen before. With trembling fingers, he picked up the doll. It felt heavier than it should. When he turned it over, he found a small zipper in the back. Inside, wrapped in an old handkerchief, were the keys. "Mom?" Lisa's voice from the doorway made both children jump. She stood there in her robe, looking confused and worried. "What are you two doing up?" Joseph held up the keys. "I found these in Maddie's doll." "Did you put them there?" Lisa's face went pale. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I put those keys in my locker at work. I never brought them home." Joseph's heart pounded in his chest as he held the flashlight with trembling hands. The basement key felt ice cold against his palm. Max pressed close to his leg, a warm, reassuring presence in the darkness. They were alone in the house. His mom was at work, and Maddie was at her friend's house for a play date. "It's now or never, buddy," Joseph whispered to Max, his voice quivering. The trapdoor's rusty hinges creaked loudly as he pulled it open. Stale air rushed up from below, carrying a musty smell that made his nose wrinkle. The beam of his flashlight revealed a set of concrete stairs disappearing into the darkness. Max whined softly, but followed as Joseph took his first careful step down. The stairs felt solid despite their age, each footfall echoing in the confined space. Joseph counted 15 steps before reaching the bottom. The hidden cellar was smaller than he'd imagined, maybe 12 feet square. His flashlight beam cut through thick clouds of dust, revealing walls of bare concrete. The air felt heavy and dead, as if it hadn't moved in years. In one corner, an old mattress lay on the floor, its once white surface now yellow and moldy. Joseph's stomach turned when he noticed dark stains on the fabric. Metal cuffs hung from the wall above it, their chains rattling softly when his light touched them. "What happened down here?" Joseph whispered, his voice barely audible. The floor caught his attention next. Deep claw marks scored the concrete, as if something, or someone, had desperately tried to escape. They reminded him of the marks Max sometimes left on their back door when he needed to go out. But these were deeper, more frantic. Max suddenly let out a low whine that made Joseph's skin crawl. The German shepherd backed away from the center of the room, his ears flattened against his head. Joseph had never seen the brave dog look so frightened. Following Mac's gaze, Joseph swept his flashlight across the wall. His breath caught in his throat as the beam illuminated crude letters etched into the concrete. The message was rough but clear. "He will come back for me." Joseph's hands shook so badly he almost dropped the flashlight. The words seemed to float in the darkness, each letter carved deep into the wall with what must have been desperate determination. Below the message, more claw marks raked the concrete, as if whoever had written it had fought until the very end. Max pressed against Joseph's legs, trembling. The dog's usual confidence was gone, replaced by an almost human fear that made everything feel even more terrifying. Together, they stood frozen in the heavy silence of the cellar, the flashlight beam fixed on those haunting words. Joseph bolted up the basement stairs, taking them two at a time, with Max close at his heels. His heart was hammering so hard he could barely breathe. He burst into the kitchen where his mom was preparing dinner, the sound of his rushed footsteps making her jump. "Mom!" he gasped, his words tumbling out. "You have to come see this. There's a hidden room down there, with chains on the walls and everything." Lisa turned from the counter, her face lined with worry. "Joseph, honey, slow down. What are you talking about?" "The trap door. I opened it, and there's this secret cellar," Joseph explained, his words rushed and desperate. "There are these horrible claw marks everywhere, and writing on the wall that says someone's coming back. And—" "Joseph, stop." Lisa's voice was firm, but gentle. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and placed them on his shoulders. "I think you're letting your imagination run wild with all these mysteries you've been trying to solve." "But Mom, it's real. I saw it with my own eyes," Joseph pleaded. "Max saw it too. Look how scared he is." Max stood beside Joseph, still trembling slightly, but Lisa shook her head. "He's probably just picking up on your anxiety, sweetie. This has gone far enough." "The whispers are from the man in the cellar." Maddie's small voice came from the doorway. She stood there, hugging her favorite stuffed animal, looking completely unfazed. "Did you find his blanket? He said he was cold." Lisa's face paled slightly, but she quickly composed herself. "Maddie, honey, there's no man in the cellar. Now both of you, go wash up for dinner." Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Joseph crept back down to the cellar with Max. His flashlight beam caught something he hadn't noticed before, a brick that stuck out slightly from the others. His fingers trembled as he worked it loose, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside was a rusted metal box, about the size of a thick book. Joseph pulled it out, his breath catching as he opened it. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings and what looked like police documents, their edges crumbling with age. But what made his blood run cold was a faded photograph at the bottom of the box. It showed a man, his face tight with fear, his hands bound behind his back. Joseph turned the photo over with shaking fingers. Written in cramped handwriting were the words, "They will never find me. I know too much. He won't let me leave." Max whined softly, pressing against Joseph's leg as they stared at the disturbing evidence of whatever terrible events had happened in this cellar. The weight of the discovery felt like ice in Joseph's stomach, and the darkness around them seemed to press in closer. The next morning, Joseph walked down the quiet street to Mrs. Whitman's house, his mind heavy with questions about the photograph and the hidden cellar. The elderly neighbor was tending to her roses when he approached, her weathered hands carefully pruning the delicate blooms. "Mrs. Whitman," Joseph called out softly, "can I ask you something about the detective who disappeared?" She straightened up slowly, her kind face growing serious. "Come sit with me, dear." She gestured to the wooden bench on her porch, away from curious ears. Once they were settled, Joseph fidgeted with his hands. What happened to him? The detective, I mean. Mrs. Whitman was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant. Detective Lawson was a good man, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He was investigating some very dangerous people, corrupt police officers who were breaking the law instead of protecting it. Joseph's heart skipped a beat. What happened? Some folks say he got too close to the truth. Mrs. Whitman's eyes met Joseph's, filled with concern. He was gathering evidence against these dirty cops when he vanished. And Joseph... She leaned closer, her voice dropping even lower. Some of those cops are still around, still wearing badges. A chill ran down Joseph's spine, despite the warm morning sun. Mrs. Whitman reached out and patted his hand gently. Be careful, dear. Sometimes the past is better left buried. That evening, Joseph sat at his computer, diving deeper into old news articles about Detective Lawson's disappearance. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he searched, determination driving him forward despite his mother's warnings to let it go. Then he found it, a small article with a grainy photograph that made his blood run cold. The picture showed Detective Lawson standing proudly next to a younger, stronger-looking Max. The caption read, Detective James Lawson and his K-9 partner Max receive commendation for outstanding service. Joseph stared at the screen, his mind racing. Max had been there. Max had been Detective Lawson's partner. Suddenly, the dog's behavior made perfect sense. The desperate scratching at the basement door, the fearful whining in the cellar, the furious digging that uncovered the badge. Max wasn't just any retired police dog. He was trying to tell them what happened to his former handler. Joseph looked over at Max, who lay in the corner of his room, watching him with those intelligent eyes. The German shepherd's ears perked up at Joseph's attention, and he tilted his head as if to say, Now you understand. You've been trying to tell us all along, haven't you, boy? Joseph whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Max stood up and padded over to him, resting his head on Joseph's knee. Joseph scratched behind his ears, his mind whirling with this new revelation. You know what happened to Detective Lawson? Joseph's hands trembled as he held out the old newspaper article to his mother. Mom, look at this. Really look. His voice was urgent but steady, determined to make her understand. Lisa leaned over the kitchen counter, her eyes scanning the photograph. The color drained from her face as she recognized Max standing proudly next to Detective Lawson. Oh my God, she whispered, pressing a hand to her mouth. Max isn't just any police dog, Joseph explained, his words tumbling out quickly. He was Detective Lawson's partner, the detective who disappeared, the one who was investigating corrupt cops. That's why Max keeps going crazy at the basement. He knows something happened down there. Lisa gripped the counter's edge, her knuckles turning white. The denial she'd been clinging to crumbled as the pieces fell into place. Max's behavior, the hidden cellar, the mysterious whispers Maddie kept hearing. We need to call the police, she said firmly, reaching for her phone. The state police, not local. This is bigger than... A deep, guttural bark cut through the air. Max stood rigid at the basement door, his hackles raised and teeth bared. But this wasn't his usual warning. There was something different in his stance, something desperate and frightened. His barking grew more intense, echoing through the house with an urgency that made Joseph's heart race. Lisa grabbed Joseph's arm, pulling him close. Joseph, stay behind me. They moved toward the basement door together, Max's frantic barking growing louder with each step. Suddenly, bright headlights swept across the living room windows, casting long shadows on the walls. The crunch of tires on gravel cut through Max's barking. A car door slammed outside, Lisa peered through the window, then stumbled backward with a sharp gasp. A tall figure emerged from a police cruiser, his badge catching the porch light as he approached their front door. "Who is it?" Joseph whispered, though something in his mother's reaction told him this wasn't help arriving. "Jack Monroe," Lisa breathed, her voice shaking. He's been with the local police department for years." She grabbed Joseph's shoulders, her eyes wide with fear. "Listen to me. Take Max and go to your room. Lock the door. Don't come out until I tell you to." Max's barking reached a fever pitch, his whole body trembling with the force of his warnings. The sound of heavy boots climbed their front porch steps. The doorbell rang, its cheerful chime a jarring contrast to the tension filling the house. Joseph looked at his mother, then at Max, understanding crashing over him like a wave. This wasn't a coincidence. Officer Monroe wasn't here to help. He was here because somehow he knew they'd discovered the truth. The evening air grew thick with tension as Officer Jack Monroe stepped into the Carter home. His smile seemed plastered on, like a mask that didn't quite fit his face. He wore his police uniform crisp and neat, but something about his presence made the room feel smaller, colder. "Max and I go way back," Jack said, his voice smooth as honey, but with an edge that made Joseph's skin crawl. "We worked together for a while before he was reassigned." Max's growl rumbled through the living room, low and continuous. His ears were flat against his head, and his eyes never left Jack's face. Joseph had never seen the German Shepherd look so fierce, so determined. Lisa stood between Jack and her children, her nurse's instincts kicking in as she assessed the situation. "That's interesting," she said carefully. "The adoption center didn't mention anything about previous handlers." "Oh, there's a lot they don't mention," Jack replied, taking a step forward. His boots squeaked against the hardwood floor. "Max here has quite a history." Joseph watched as Jack reached out toward Max, his fingers extended in what should have been a friendly gesture. But there was something wrong about it. Something in the way Jack's hand trembled slightly, in the way his smile didn't reach his eyes. Max's reaction was explosive. The German Shepherd lunged forward, teeth bared, a snarl ripping from his throat that made everyone jump. His powerful body blocked the space between Jack and the Carter family, his message clear. "Stay back." Jack yanked his hand away, and for a split second, his friendly facade cracked. Joseph caught a glimpse of something dark and angry in the officer's eyes, something that made his heart pound harder against his ribs. "Well," Jack said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow in the tense room. "Guess he still remembers me." He straightened his uniform, his badge catching the light. "Dogs have long memories, you know. They never forget certain things." Maddie, who had been hiding behind Lisa, peeked out and whispered, "He's the man from the Whispers." Her words were so quiet, Joseph barely caught them, but Jack's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. Lisa's hand tightened on Joseph's shoulder. "Officer Monroe," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. "It's getting late, and the children have school tomorrow." Max hadn't moved from his protective stance, his body still rigid with tension. His growl continued, a constant warning that filled the room with its deep vibration. Joseph could feel the dog's muscles trembling with restraint, like he was holding himself back from doing more than just growling. Jack's eyes drifted toward the basement door, his gaze lingering there a moment too long. "Nice house you've got here," he said, his voice casual but probing. "These old places, they've got so many interesting features. Basements, hidden spaces." He paused, watching their reactions. "Found anything unusual down there?" Lisa's face remained carefully neutral as she adjusted her nurse's scrub jacket. "Oh, we haven't really explored much," she said lightly. "It's mostly storage right now. Boxes everywhere. You know how moving is." Mac's growl deepened at the mention of the basement, his protective stance becoming even more rigid. Joseph noticed how Jack's fingers twitched at the sound, like he was fighting the urge to reach for something at his hip. "Funny thing about Max," Jack continued, his smile never reaching his eyes. "He was always such a dedicated partner, followed every command, every lead." He took a slow step closer, causing Max to bare his teeth. "But sometimes he got a little too loyal. Wouldn't let certain things go, you might say." The way he said it made Joseph's stomach twist. There was something threatening hidden beneath the casual words, like poison wrapped in sugar. Later that night, after Jack finally left and Lisa had double-checked all the locks, Joseph couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying Jack's words, the way he'd looked at the basement door, how Max had reacted to his presence. Around midnight, Joseph slipped out of bed. Max immediately rose from his spot by the door, padding silently beside him. Together, they crept down the stairs and out the back door, making their way to where Jack's police car sat parked across the street. The night was quiet, except for the soft chirp of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. Joseph's heart thundered in his chest as he approached the car, Max standing guard beside him. Pressing his face against the passenger window, he cupped his hands around his eyes to block out the streetlight's glare. What he saw made his blood run cold. On the passenger seat lay a manila folder, and clearly visible on its tab was their address written in neat block letters. But what made Joseph's breath catch was what lay beside it, a pair of old handcuffs, their metal surface dark with rust, looking exactly like the ones he'd seen mounted on the wall in the hidden cellar. Mac's low growl pulled Joseph's attention away from the window. The German shepherd's ears were pricked forward, his body tense. Joseph quickly stepped back from the car, his heart racing as he realized what this meant. Jack Monroe wasn't here by chance. He knew about the basement. He knew about everything. Joseph sat at his computer, the soft glow of the screen illuminating his worried face. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard as he dug deeper into Jack Monroe's past. Each new detail made his heart beat faster. "Multiple complaints of excessive force," he whispered to himself, scrolling through old news articles. 3 missing persons cases where he was the lead investigator. He clicked on another link. All unsolved. Max hadn't moved from his post outside Joseph's bedroom door for hours. The German shepherd's eyes remained alert, his ears twitching at every small sound. Even when Joseph brought him water, Max would only take quick sips before returning to his vigilant watch. Around midnight, Joseph heard his mom's soft snoring from down the hall. He looked at Max, who immediately stood up, ready to follow. "We need to check something, boy," Joseph whispered, patting the dog's head. They crept downstairs together, their footsteps silent on the carpet. The basement door creaked slightly as Joseph opened it, making him wince. Max pressed close to his side as they descended the stairs, the dog's body tense but determined. Joseph clicked on his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the concrete floor. Something caught his eye, a slight difference in the pattern of the floorboards near the far wall. Moving closer, he noticed one board seemed slightly raised at the edge. His hands trembled as he knelt down. Max whined softly, pawing at the spot. Joseph worked his fingers under the edge of the board, pulling upward. It came loose with a quiet groan. The beam of his flashlight revealed something metallic in the small space beneath. Joseph reached in, his fingers closing around cold metal. As he lifted it out, his breath caught in his throat. It was a police radio, old and covered in dust. But what made Joseph's blood run cold was the dark brownish stain that covered one side. Dried blood, long since turned to rust-colored patches on the device. Max growled softly, his nose twitching as he sniffed the radio. Joseph turned it over in his hands, imagining the desperate scene that must have played out here. Someone, probably the missing detective, had tried to call for help, had hidden this radio as evidence. but help never came. "He was down here," Joseph whispered, his voice shaking. "The detective was trapped down here and he tried to radio for help." He looked at Max, whose eyes seemed to hold a deep sadness. "Your old partner. He was trying to expose something, wasn't he? And Jack Monroe." He couldn't finish the thought. Max pressed closer to Joseph, as if trying to protect him from the weight of this discovery. Together, they stared at the blood-stained radio, physical proof of the violence that had occurred in this very basement. The morning sun cast long shadows through the kitchen windows as Lisa prepared breakfast. Joseph sat at the table, pushing his scrambled eggs around his plate, his mind still racing from last night's discovery. Max lay alert by the door, his ears perking up at every sound from outside. The sudden crunch of tires on gravel made them all freeze. Through the window, they saw Jack Monroe's police cruiser pulling into their driveway. This time, there was no pretense of friendliness on his face. "Mom," Joseph whispered, his voice tight with fear. Max stood up, his hackles rising as heavy footsteps approached the front door. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the house. Lisa straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath, and went to answer it. Joseph crept closer to listen, while Max pressed against his leg protectively. "Good morning, Officer Monroe," Lisa said, her voice steady despite the tension Joseph could hear underneath. Jack Monroe didn't bother with pleasantries. "I know you've been digging," he said, his words carrying a clear threat. "You and your boy both." Lisa crossed her arms, blocking the doorway. "I'm sorry, but I don't know what you're talking about." Monroe stepped closer, forcing Lisa to tilt her head up to maintain eye contact. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that made Joseph's skin crawl. "You have something that belongs to me, and I want it back." Max let out a low growl from behind Lisa. Monroe's eyes flickered to the dog, then back to Lisa's face. His hand twitched slightly toward his hip. "I think you should leave," Lisa said firmly, though Joseph could see her hands trembling slightly. Monroe's face hardened. "This isn't over," he said, turning to go. As he walked back to his car, Joseph caught a glimpse of something metallic tucked into his waistband, the unmistakable shape of a handgun. The moment Monroe's car disappeared down the road, Lisa shut and locked the door. She leaned against it, finally letting out the breath she'd been holding. "Joseph," she called out, knowing he was listening. "Come here." Joseph stepped out from his hiding spot, Max right beside him. His mother's face was pale but determined. "Tell me everything," she said. "Everything you found. No more secrets." Maddie appeared at the top of the stairs, clutching her favorite stuffed animal. "The man in the basement is scared," she said softly. "He says the bad policeman is coming back." Lisa and Joseph exchanged worried looks as Max positioned himself at the foot of the stairs, standing guard over their family. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, but it no longer felt warm and welcoming. Instead, it felt like a spotlight, exposing them to whatever darkness was coming their way. The evening had settled into a peaceful quiet when the lights suddenly flickered and died. The Carter house plunged into total darkness, making Maddie let out a small squeak of fear. "It's okay, sweetie," Lisa said, fumbling for her phone in her pocket. The blue light from her screen cast eerie shadows on the walls. "No signal," she muttered, her voice tight with worry. Joseph felt Maddie's small hands grip his arm. "I'm scared," she whispered, pressing close to him. Max, who had been dozing by the fireplace, suddenly lifted his head, ears alert. A car door slammed outside, the sound sharp and final in the darkness. Then another, and another. Max exploded into action, racing to the front door with a fury Joseph had never heard before. His barks were deep and threatening, echoing through the silent house. Through the living room window, Joseph could make out 3 shadowy figures moving across their front lawn. The beam of a flashlight swept across the grass, and for a moment Jack Monroe's face was illuminated, hard and determined. "Upstairs," Lisa whispered urgently, pushing her children toward the staircase. "Now!" But when Joseph tried the back door on their way, the handle wouldn't turn. He tried again, harder this time. "Mom," he said, his voice shaking, "it's locked. From the outside." Lisa ran to the front door, but it was the same story. They were trapped inside their own house. Max continued his defensive barking, positioning himself between the family and the front door. His tail was straight, his body rigid with protective instinct. "The windows," Lisa said, trying to keep her voice calm for Maddie's sake. "We need to." The sound of breaking glass from the kitchen cut her off. Maddie buried her face in Joseph's shirt, trembling. "Mrs. Carter," Jack Monroe's voice called out from the darkness, "we need to have a conversation about what your boy found in that basement." Joseph felt his mother's hand grab his arm. She pulled both him and Maddie closer, backing them toward the stairs. Max stayed at the front, his growls growing deeper and more threatening. "You can't hide what happened here forever," Lisa called out, her voice stronger than Joseph expected. "We know what you did to that detective." A harsh laugh echoed through the darkness. "Do you?" Monroe's voice was closer now. "Then you know exactly why I can't let this go." Heavy footsteps creaked on the front porch. The doorknob slowly began to turn. Max's barking reached a fever pitch as moonlight filtered through the windows, revealing the silhouettes of 3 men preparing to force their way in. Joseph's heart hammered in his chest as he watched the doorknob turn. In the darkness, his mind raced, searching for a way out. Then it hit him. The basement might be their only chance. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "we need to get out. The basement. There might be another way." Lisa's eyes widened with understanding. With trembling fingers, she pulled the basement keys from her pocket. The metal felt cold against her palm. She guided her children toward the kitchen, where the basement door waited. Maddie clung to Joseph's hand, her small fingers squeezing tight. "I'm scared," she whimpered. "Shh," Lisa soothed, though her own voice quivered. "We have to be very quiet now." The front door creaked open, and Jack Monroe's heavy boots thudded against the wooden floor. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness like a knife. "Come on out, Carter family," Monroe called, his voice deceptively friendly. "Let's have a little chat about what you've been poking around in." Lisa's hand shook as she fitted the key into the basement lock. The click seemed impossibly loud in the quiet house. She eased the door open, wincing at the slight squeak of the hinges. "Down," she mouthed to her children, guiding them onto the first step. Max stood his ground at the front of the house, his muscular body tense and ready. His growl was low and menacing, a sound that spoke of his police training and his absolute dedication to protecting his new family. Monroe's flashlight beam swept across the living room. "You know, this could all be so simple," he said, his footsteps getting closer. "Just hand over what you found, and we can forget this whole thing." Joseph helped Maddie down the basement stairs, keeping one hand on the wall to guide them in the pitch darkness. The musty air felt thick in his lungs, but he forced himself to breathe quietly. Max's growl grew deeper as Monroe approached, the sound rumbling through the house like distant thunder. The German Shepherd's training was evident in every line of his body. He wasn't just a family pet anymore. He was a police dog again, facing down a threat to those he protected. "That dog," Monroe muttered, his friendly tone slipping. "Should have known he'd remember everything." His flashlight beam swung toward the kitchen, where Lisa was just slipping through the basement door. The basement steps creaked under their feet as the Carter family descended into the darkness. Above them, Max's growls turned into sharp, aggressive barks, a clear warning to Monroe to stay back. "Hiding won't help you," Monroe called out, his voice harder now. "We need to deal with this. Tonight." In the basement's suffocating darkness, Lisa held Maddie close while Joseph pressed himself against the cold concrete wall. Their breathing seemed too loud, too obvious, even though they tried to stay quiet. Above them, the floorboards creaked under Monroe's heavy footsteps. "Lisa," Monroe called out, his voice dripping with false warmth. "I know you're down there. Let's be reasonable about this." Lisa's hand found Joseph's arm in the darkness. "We need to find another way out," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "There has to be something we missed." Joseph's mind raced to the hidden trapdoor they'd discovered earlier. Could it lead somewhere? But before he could whisper his thought to his mother, the basement door groaned open. Light from above spilled down the wooden stairs, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for them like grasping fingers. Maddie buried her face in Lisa's shirt, trying to muffle her frightened whimper. Lisa's arms tightened around her daughter, her heart pounding so hard she was sure Monroe could hear it. Max's growls grew fiercer, more threatening. The German shepherd's nails clicked against the floor as he positioned himself at the top of the stairs, his body a dark silhouette against the light from above. "Call off your dog, Lisa," Monroe said, his footsteps slow and deliberate on the creaking stairs. "We both know how this ends if you don't cooperate." The beam of his flashlight swept across the basement, searching. Joseph could see the dust particles dancing in the light, could hear the subtle shift of Monroe's leather holster as he descended. Each step brought him closer, the wood groaning beneath his weight. Max's growls turned into sharp, warning barks. The sound echoed off the basement walls, filling the space with a fierce determination to protect his family. Monroe paused on the stairs, and Joseph could see the man's shadow hesitate. "Last chance," Monroe called out, his friendly tone finally cracking to reveal the steel beneath. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Lisa's fingers dug into Joseph's arm as she pulled him and Maddie deeper into the shadows. They could hear other footsteps above now, Monroe's accomplices moving around the house, blocking their escape routes. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness again, closer now. Joseph could smell the musty air of the basement mixing with the leather of Monroe's jacket. The former officer was nearly at the bottom of the stairs. Max's barking suddenly changed pitch, more urgent, more aggressive. There was a scuffle at the top of the stairs, and Monroe's flashlight beam jerked wildly across the basement walls. "Shut that dog up!" Monroe hissed to someone above. His voice had lost all pretense of friendliness now, replaced by cold determination. The basement door creaked again, wider this time. More footsteps joined Monroe's on the stairs, and Lisa pulled her children even closer as multiple beams of light began searching the darkness. The basement erupted into chaos as Max's powerful body slammed into Monroe, his teeth gleaming in the scattered flashlight beam. The former officer's shoulder hit the wooden stairs with a sickening thud, and his grunt of pain echoed off the concrete walls. Joseph's fingers found the cold metal pipe in the darkness, his heart thundering in his chest. Without hesitation, he swung it hard, connecting with Monroe's hand. The flashlight went flying, spinning across the floor and casting wild shadows before going dark. "You little—" Monroe's curse was cut short as he scrambled backward, his boots scraping against the wooden steps. Max's fierce growls filled the basement, mixing with Maddie's frightened whimpers and Lisa's rapid breathing. "They're down here!" Monroe's voice boomed up the stairs, rage replacing his earlier false charm. "Barricade the doors!" Heavy footsteps pounded above them, and Lisa pulled Joseph and Maddie closer to her. The darkness felt suffocating now, pressing in around them like a heavy blanket. They could hear Monroe's labored breathing as he retreated up the stairs, could feel the vibrations of his accomplices moving furniture above. Max stood at the bottom of the stairs, his body rigid and alert. His growls hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd grown deeper, more threatening. The German Shepherd's training had kicked in fully now, transforming him from a family pet into the protective police dog he'd once been. Joseph's hands were shaking, still gripping the metal pipe. The cold weight of it felt reassuring, even as his mind raced with the reality of what he'd just done. He'd actually hit Monroe, a former police officer. There was no going back now. Lisa's arm wrapped around Joseph's shoulders, pulling him close. He could feel her trembling too, but her voice was steady when she whispered, "Good thinking with the pipe, sweetheart. But we need to move. Now." Maddie pressed herself against her mother's side, her small fingers clutching Lisa's shirt. "Mom," she whispered, her voice quavering, "I'm scared." Above them, they could hear the screech of furniture being dragged across the floor. Chairs, tables, anything heavy enough to trap them down here. Monroe's accomplices were sealing them in, turning their hiding place into a prison. "Block every exit!" Monroe's voice carried down to them, tight with fury. "They're not getting out until we find what we came for!" Max's ears perked up at the sound of Monroe's voice, and his growl deepened. The German Shepherd's loyalty was unwavering. He wouldn't let Monroe near his family again. But they were trapped now, sealed in the basement with only the hidden trapdoor as a possible escape route. The darkness pressed in around them as the last echoes of movement faded above. They were alone in the basement now, with only the sound of their breathing and Max's continuous growls breaking the heavy silence. Joseph squinted through the darkness, his eyes finally adjusting enough to make out shapes in the gloom. There, near the ceiling, a metal grate caught what little light filtered down from upstairs. His heart leaped. A ventilation shaft. "Mom," he whispered urgently, tugging on Lisa's sleeve. "Look, up there. Maddie could fit through that." Lisa followed his gaze, measuring the shaft's size with her eyes. It was small, barely large enough for an adult to squeeze an arm through, but perfect for Maddie's tiny frame. She pulled Maddie close, kneeling to look her daughter in the eyes. "Sweetie, we need you to be very brave," Lisa whispered, smoothing Maddie's hair with trembling fingers. "Do you think you can crawl through that vent up there, like playing in the playground tunnel?" Maddie's lower lip quivered, but she nodded. "Will Max come with me?" "Max needs to stay here to protect us," Joseph explained softly, giving his sister's hand a squeeze. "But you're the only one small enough to fit. You can be our hero." Above them, heavy boots paced across the floor. Then came the distinctive sound of a key turning in the basement door's lock. The metallic click seemed to echo through the darkness, making their situation even more desperate. "We're locked in," Lisa breathed, her voice barely audible. "Maddie, this is very important. We need to get you up there now." Joseph and Lisa positioned themselves beneath the vent, creating a human ladder. Lisa braced herself against the wall, bending slightly as Joseph climbed onto her shoulders. His muscles strained as he reached up, unscrewing the vent cover with shaking fingers. "Okay, Maddie," Lisa whispered, helping their daughter climb up. "Joseph will lift you." Joseph gritted his teeth as Maddie stepped onto his shoulders. The shaft looked even smaller up close, but Maddie showed no hesitation. She grabbed the edge of the opening and pulled herself up with the natural agility of a child. Max watched intently, his ears perked forward, maintaining his guard position at the bottom of the stairs. His low growl was a constant reminder of the danger above them. "I'm in." Maddie's tiny voice drifted down from the shaft. They could hear her moving through the metal tunnel, her progress marked by soft shuffling sounds. "Keep going, sweetheart," Lisa encouraged, her voice catching. "Look for a grate that leads outside." The shuffling continued, growing fainter as Maddie crawled further. Joseph and Lisa stood in tense silence, straining to hear their daughter's progress. After what felt like an eternity, Maddie's whisper floated down to them. "I see outside. There's another grate." Lisa let out a shaky breath of relief, but they all froze as Monroe's voice carried down from above. "They're too quiet down there. Check on them." Maddie's small feet touched the damp grass as she wiggled free from the ventilation shaft. Her heart pounded in her chest as she crouched low, just like she'd seen in spy movies. The night air was cold against her skin, and shadows seemed to dance around every corner of the yard. She could see Mrs. Whitman's house next door, its warm porch light glowing like a beacon of hope. Taking a deep breath, Maddie darted across the lawn, staying close to the bushes. Every snap of a twig made her jump, but she kept moving, remembering how brave Joseph always told her she could be. When she reached Mrs. Whitman's front door, Maddie's small fist hammered against it urgently. "Mrs. Whitman," she whispered as loud as she dared. "Please help. Please." The porch light flickered twice, and then the door opened just enough to reveal Mrs. Whitman's concerned face. The elderly woman's eyes widened at the sight of Maddie in her pajamas, trembling on her doorstep. "Child, what on earth?" Mrs. Whitman pulled Maddie inside quickly, locking the door behind them. "Bad men," Maddie whispered, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "They're in our house. Mom and Joseph are trapped in the basement with Max." Mrs. Whitman's face hardened with determination. She led Maddie to her floral print couch and wrapped her in a warm blanket. "Stay here, sweetheart," she said, reaching for her phone. "I'm calling the police right now." Meanwhile, in the basement, Joseph and Lisa were desperately throwing their weight against the locked door. The solid wood didn't even shudder under their efforts. Lisa's shoulder ached, but she kept trying, knowing they had to find a way out. "It's no use," Joseph panted, stepping back. "The door's too strong." Suddenly, Max's behavior changed. The German shepherd stopped his defensive stance at the stairs and ran to the far wall of the basement. His whines were urgent as he scratched at the concrete, his claws leaving marks on the surface. Joseph watched Max's frantic pawing, his mind racing. "Mom," he said slowly, "Max wouldn't act like this for no reason. He's trying to tell us something." Lisa joined him, studying the wall where Max was scratching. "These bricks look different from the others," she observed, running her hand over the surface. "They're newer." Joseph moved closer, excitement building in his chest. "Max must know something about this wall. Remember what Mrs. Whitman said about the detective investigating dirty cops? What if—" He pressed his hands against different bricks, feeling for any movement. "What if there's another way out?" Max's whining grew more insistent, his paws scratching at a specific spot near the floor. Joseph knelt beside him, hope rising in his chest as he examined the area more closely. There had to be something there. Max knew it, and now they just had to figure out what it was. Joseph's fingers trembled as they traced the edge of the wooden panel. It was cleverly disguised, painted to match the concrete wall, but age had made the wood warp slightly. With Max's urgent whining spurring him on, he dug his fingers into the gap and pulled. The panel came away with a soft creak, revealing a dark opening about 3 feet wide. The musty smell of earth and decay wafted out, making Joseph's nose wrinkle. Lisa crouched beside him, shining her phone's flashlight into the darkness. The beam revealed a crude tunnel, its walls supported by old wooden beams that disappeared into the blackness ahead. "Someone dug this," Lisa whispered, her voice tight with fear and hope. "Maybe the detective. Before Joseph could respond, they heard the metallic click of the basement door lock turning. Their hearts froze as Jack Monroe's voice drifted down the stairs, smooth as honey, but dripping with menace. "No more running, kid." His footsteps creaked on the wooden stairs, slow and deliberate. "Let's talk about what you found down here." Lisa grabbed Joseph's arm, her fingers digging into his skin. "Get in," she hissed urgently. "Now!" Mac's muscles tensed, his ears flattening against his head as Jack's boots appeared on the steps. The German shepherd's growl started low in his chest, building to a thunderous warning that echoed off the basement walls. Joseph scrambled into the tunnel entrance, the rough earth scraping his palms. Lisa followed close behind, her breathing quick and shallow in the confined space. Jack had just stepped onto the basement floor when Max launched himself forward, a blur of fur and fury. His teeth snapped inches from Jack's arm, forcing the corrupt officer to stumble backward. The flashlight in Jack's hand clattered to the ground, spinning wildly and casting crazy shadows across the walls. "You stupid mutt!" Jack shouted, his friendly facade finally cracking. Joseph and Lisa didn't waste the precious seconds Max had bought them. They crawled deeper into the tunnel, the darkness swallowing them whole. The earth was cool and damp against their hands and knees, and the space was barely big enough for them to move through. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of the struggle. Mac's fierce barking, Jack's cursing, the thud of bodies against walls. Lisa choked back a sob as they crawled, worried about leaving Max behind. "He'll be okay, Mom," Joseph whispered, though his voice shook. "Max knows what he's doing. He's protecting us, just like he tried to protect his last partner." They kept moving through the darkness, the tunnel seeming to stretch endlessly ahead. The sounds from the basement grew fainter, but the fear of Jack Monroe following them kept them crawling forward, deeper into the earth, away from the horror they'd left behind. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting slightly as Joseph and Lisa crawled through the cramped space. Their hands and knees were raw from the rough earth, and the air grew thinner with each passing moment. Just when Lisa felt her lungs might burst, Joseph's hand touched something different: wooden boards. "There's some kind of panel here," he whispered, pushing against it with trembling hands. The wooden barrier gave way suddenly, and cool night air rushed in. Joseph tumbled out first, followed by Lisa, both of them gasping as they emerged into a small clearing in the woods behind their house. The moon cast eerie shadows through the trees, but the familiar sight of their backyard in the distance gave them hope. A series of loud barks echoed from the tunnel, and seconds later, Max burst through the opening. His fur was ruffled and dirty, but his eyes were bright and alert as he positioned himself protectively in front of Joseph and Lisa. In the distance, police sirens began to wail, their sound growing louder with each passing second. Lisa's shoulders sagged with relief. Mrs. Whitman had come through for them. "Maddie," Lisa breathed. "She must have made it." They heard a door slam from the direction of their house, followed by hurried footsteps. Jack Monroe appeared at the edge of the woods, his face twisted with rage. When he spotted them, he turned to run, but Max was faster. The German shepherd launched himself forward with incredible speed, his training taking over. He slammed into Jack's back, sending the corrupt officer sprawling face first into the dirt. Max stood over him, teeth bared, keeping him pinned as red and blue lights flooded the area. Police cars screeched to a halt in front of the house. Officers poured out, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Jack didn't resist as they pulled him to his feet and handcuffed him. His previously friendly demeanor was gone, replaced by cold anger. As two officers led him toward a patrol car, Jack turned his head toward Joseph and Lisa. "You don't even know the whole story," he muttered, his voice low and bitter. Joseph and Lisa exchanged confused glances. Before they could process his words, Maddie came running from Mrs. Whitman's house, throwing herself into her mother's arms. Lisa hugged her daughter tightly, tears streaming down her face. Max trotted back to them, his tail wagging slightly as he pressed against Joseph's leg. Joseph knelt down and wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in the thick fur. "You saved us," he whispered. "You saved us all." The police lights continued to flash across the yard, illuminating their house, a place that now held so many dark secrets. As Lisa held her children close, she couldn't help but wonder about Jack's final words. What else could there possibly be to this nightmare? As the police car's door slammed shut, Jack Monroe's smirk sent chills down Joseph's spine. Through the window, Jack's words carried an unsettling weight. "You're still missing the biggest piece." Lisa stepped forward, her nurse's instincts kicking in as she addressed the lead investigator. "The basement," she said firmly. "You need to search everything down there. And there's a tunnel. We just escaped through it." The officers moved quickly, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness as they descended into the basement. Joseph watched from the top of the stairs, Maddie clutching his hand tightly. Max stood beside them, his posture alert but calmer than he'd been in days. "Over here," an officer called out, his voice echoing from deep within the tunnel. "We've got something." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. More police cars arrived, along with a crime scene unit. The entire area was cordoned off with yellow tape, and powerful floodlights illuminated the yard and basement. Lisa held her children close as they watched from their front porch. Officers carefully carried evidence bags from the basement, their contents casting strange shadows in the artificial light. Max's eyes never left the basement door, his body tense but steady. Then came the moment that changed everything. Two officers emerged from the tunnel, carrying something wrapped in protective covering. Behind them, another officer held up a plastic evidence bag containing a badly corroded police badge. "It's him," one of the officers said quietly. "It's Detective Lawson." Max's ears lowered, but his posture remained strong. Joseph knelt beside him, wrapping an arm around the dog's neck. "You knew all along, didn't you?" he whispered. "You were trying to tell us where he was." The German shepherd turned to look at Joseph, his eyes reflecting years of carried burden. This had been more than just strange behavior or leftover training. It had been Max's mission all along, waiting for someone to finally understand his warnings. Lisa watched as more evidence was cataloged and photographed. The basement that had once seemed merely creepy now stood revealed as a crime scene, its secrets finally exposed to the light. She thought about all the times she'd dismissed Joseph's concerns, all the signs they'd tried to ignore. The crime scene technicians worked methodically, their cameras flashing as they documented every detail. Each flash illuminated Max's face, showing the quiet dignity of a K-9 officer who had never forgotten his duty, even years after losing his partner. As dawn began to break over the horizon, Max finally sat down, his vigilant stance relaxing for the first time since they'd brought him home. His mission was complete. Detective Lawson would finally receive the justice he deserved, and the truth Max had tried so hard to reveal was now impossible to ignore. Detective Ramirez stood in the Carters' living room, his face grim as he held a manila folder. The morning sun filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor, where Max lay protectively at Joseph's feet. "We've confirmed the identity," Detective Ramirez said softly. "The remains belonged to Detective Mark Lawson. He disappeared 6 years ago while working on a sensitive case." Lisa sank into the couch, pulling Maddie close to her. Joseph remained standing, his hand resting on Max's head. "What kind of case?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Detective Ramirez glanced at Maddie before choosing his words carefully. Detective Lawson was investigating corruption within the department. He'd uncovered evidence that some officers were involved in serious crimes. He paused, his expression darkening. Jack Monroe was his partner at the time. Joseph's eyes widened as the pieces clicked into place. He looked down at Max, who stared back with those knowing brown eyes. The German Shepherd's behavior suddenly made perfect sense. The desperate scratching at the basement door, the frantic digging in the yard where they'd found the badge, his immediate distrust of Monroe. Max knew, Joseph said, his voice thick with emotion. He was trying to tell us where Detective Lawson was this whole time. He was Detective Lawson's K-9 partner, wasn't he? Detective Ramirez nodded. One of our best teams. After Lawson disappeared, Max was never the same. He wouldn't work with anyone else, especially not Monroe, who tried to take him as his new partner. Lisa reached out to stroke Max's fur. That's why Monroe came here when he heard we'd adopted Max. He was worried Max would lead us to the truth. Max never forgot, Joseph said quietly, kneeling beside the dog. He never gave up trying to find justice for his partner. Max pressed his nose against Joseph's hand, his tail giving a small wag. For the first time since they'd brought him home, the tension seemed to leave his body. His mission, the one he'd carried for 6 long years, was finally complete. The afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Lisa sorted through the mail. Bills, advertisements, and then an official-looking envelope that made her pause. The return address showed it was from a retired K-9 training officer named Thomas Bennett. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. As she read the first few lines, she had to sit down at the kitchen table. "Joseph," she called out, her voice unsteady. "Could you come here, honey?" Joseph walked in from the living room where he'd been doing homework, Max padding along faithfully beside him. The German Shepherd's eyes were alert, watching Lisa's every move. "What's wrong, Mom?" Joseph asked, noticing her pale face. Lisa took a deep breath, smoothing the letter on the table. "This is from the officer who trained Max years ago." She paused, gathering her thoughts. Before Max was assigned to work with Detective Lawson, he had a different handler. Joseph sat down across from her, his brow furrowed in confusion. Max settled between them, his head resting on Joseph's knee. "Your father," Lisa said softly, her eyes filling with tears. "Max was your father's K-9 partner when he first joined the force." Joseph stared at her, his mouth falling open. His hand automatically went to Max's head, fingers curling in the thick fur. "Dad," he whispered, "but how?" Lisa wiped her eyes and continued reading. "According to Officer Bennett, Max and your father worked together for almost 2 years. They were an incredible team." Her voice caught. "But when your father was injured in the line of duty and had to leave the force, Max was reassigned." Joseph looked down at Max, who gazed back with those wise brown eyes. All this time, this connection had existed without them knowing. The dog who had protected them, who had helped uncover the truth about Detective Lawson, had once been his father's loyal partner. "That's why you chose us at the shelter," Joseph said to Max, his voice thick with emotion. "You recognized something about us, didn't you? Maybe you could smell Dad on us." Max's tail thumped gently against the floor, and he pressed his nose into Joseph's hand. Lisa reached across the table and took Joseph's other hand. "Officer Bennett says that K-9s never forget their handlers. Even years later, they remember the scent, the bond they shared." Joseph slid out of his chair and wrapped his arms around Max's neck, burying his face in the dog's fur. Max stayed perfectly still, letting the boy hold him. "You've been watching over us this whole time," Joseph whispered. "Just like Dad would have wanted." Lisa watched them, tears flowing freely now. In this moment, she could see it so clearly. The invisible thread that had brought Max back to them, completing their family circle in a way she never could have imagined. Joseph's shoulders began to shake as the full weight of the revelation hit him. Tears he'd been holding back for so long, tears for his father, for all the lonely nights, for every time he'd wished his dad could see him grow up, finally broke free. He slid to the kitchen floor, his back against the cabinet, and Max immediately moved closer, pressing his warm body against the boy's side. Lisa knelt beside her son, her own tears falling freely. "Your father would be so proud of you, honey. The way you never gave up, how you helped solve the mystery. You're so much like him." Joseph's fingers curled into Max's fur, holding on as if the dog were an anchor in a storm of emotions. "Did you know?" he whispered to Max. "Did you know who we were the whole time?" Max's brown eyes, full of ancient wisdom and unconditional love, met Joseph's gaze. The dog let out a soft whine and gently licked Joseph's cheek, tasting the salt of his tears. "Look at this," Lisa said softly, pointing to a paragraph in the letter. "Officer Bennett says your father and Max had a special signal. Your dad would tap his chest twice, and Max would place his paw there." With trembling hands, Joseph sat up straighter and tapped his chest twice. Without hesitation, Max lifted his paw and placed it directly over Joseph's heart. Fresh tears spilled down the boy's cheeks. "You remember?" Joseph choked out. "You really remember him." Lisa wrapped her arms around both her son and the dog who had found his way back to their family. "Max didn't just choose us at the shelter by chance," she said. "He recognized something in you, Joseph. Maybe it was your father's spirit, or his determination, or even just his scent lingering in our family." Joseph buried his face in Max's neck, feeling the strong, steady heartbeat of the dog who had protected them, guided them, and ultimately helped bring justice for Detective Lawson. But more than that, Max had been carrying a piece of his father's legacy all along. "You found your way back home," Joseph whispered into Max's fur. "After all these years, you found us." Max's tail thumped steadily against the floor, and he stayed perfectly still, allowing Joseph to hold him as long as he needed. The dog's presence was solid and reassuring, just as it had been through all their recent ordeals. But now, that presence carried an even deeper meaning, a connection to the past, to the father Joseph missed so desperately. Lisa watched as her son clung to Max, seeing in that moment not just a boy and his dog, but the beautiful way life sometimes came full circle. Max had protected Joseph's father years ago, and now he was here, protecting Joseph, completing a promise made long ago. The autumn breeze rustled through the tall grass as Joseph and Max walked their familiar path through the fields behind their house. The setting sun painted everything in warm golden hues, making Max's fur glow like burnished copper. Joseph watched as the German shepherd trotted ahead, nose to the ground but ears always alert, still every inch the protective guardian he'd been trained to be. Lisa had found them a new house closer to town, a bright, cheerful place with a big backyard and no dark secrets lurking in its basement. But for now, these evening walks had become Joseph's favorite part of the day, a time when he could feel closest to both Max and the memory of his father. "Mom says we'll be moving next month," Joseph said softly to Max, who immediately turned his head to look at the boy, those intelligent brown eyes focused and understanding. "But don't worry, you're coming with us. You're family now." Back at the house, Maddie sat at the kitchen table, coloring a picture of their family, stick figures of herself, Joseph, and Lisa, with a big brown dog prominently featured in the center. Lisa watched her daughter from the doorway, noting how Maddie had drawn Max larger than all of them, like a protective shield around their family. "Is Max happy we're moving, Mommy?" Maddie asked, not looking up from her drawing. Lisa smiled, walking over to smooth her daughter's hair. I think Max is happy wherever we are, sweetie, as long as we're together. The sound of the back door opening announced Joseph's return with Max. The dog shook himself, then padded over to his water bowl, which Maddie had decorated with stick-on stars and hearts. Good walk? Lisa asked, pulling out leftovers for dinner. Joseph nodded, his face more peaceful than it had been in months. Max showed me a new trail today. He always knows exactly where he's going. Lisa watched as Max finished his water and moved to sit between her children, just as he'd done every evening since they'd learned the truth about his connection to their family. He'd become their anchor, a living bridge between their past and present. You know, Lisa said, setting plates on the table, your father would be amazed at how well you've handled everything, Joseph. How you trusted your instincts, just like Max did. Joseph reached down to scratch behind Max's ears, and the dog leaned into his touch with a contented sigh. I think Dad knew what he was doing when he trained Max, Joseph said quietly. He made sure someone would always be watching over us, even if he couldn't be here himself. Max's tail thumped against the floor, and he looked between each family member with those knowing eyes that had seen so much. He wasn't just their protector anymore. He was their healer, their connection to the past, and their guide toward a brighter future. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the front porch of the Carter house. The wooden board still held the day's warmth, making it the perfect spot for Joseph and Max to rest after their afternoon walk. The German shepherd's breathing had settled into a peaceful rhythm. His powerful frame relaxed for perhaps the first time since they'd met him. Joseph watched as golden light filtered through the trees, painting dappled patterns on Max's fur. The dog's eyes were half closed, but his ears still twitched occasionally at distant sounds. Old habits of a lifetime of vigilance slowly giving way to the comfort of security. Through the screen door, Joseph could hear Lisa preparing dinner, while Maddie hummed along to a song only she knew. The familiar sounds of home mixed with the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the occasional chirp of birds settling in for the evening. Max shifted slightly, pressing closer to Joseph's side. His fur was soft under Joseph's hand as he stroked the dog's head. In these quiet moments, it was hard to imagine the fierce protector who had helped them uncover the truth. Now he was simply their Max, loyal, loving, and finally at peace. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, reminding Joseph of all the evenings his father must have spent training Max. He wondered if they had shared moments like this too, quiet times, when the work was done, and they could just be together. Joseph felt a surge of gratitude well up in his chest. Max had been more than just a dog who needed a home. He had been a guardian angel, a link to his father, and now an irreplaceable part of their family. Thank you for everything, buddy, Joseph whispered softly. Max responded with a contented sigh, shifting to rest his head on Joseph's lap. His brown eyes, though heavy with sleepiness, held that same knowing look they'd always had, as if he'd known all along that this was where he was meant to be. Here, on this porch, with this family, Max was finally home, where he had always belonged. If you enjoyed the story of Joseph, Lisa, and Max, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. If you enjoyed the story of Joseph, Lisa, and Max, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.